we move on to the first session for today and the season 6 for the 2 day long conference. And in order to do that, may I please request the chairpersons to join the session. But before that, let me mention the name of the sponsors without whose help this could not be made possible. This session is sponsored by the unrestricted academic grant from the JB Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals Limited. Can we have the AV please? In order to start the session, may I please request the resident chairpersons to join the session, and may I please request Dr. S.C. Kundu, Dr. Deepankar Dotto, Dr. Ashish Kumar Sinha, Dr. Orindam Pandey, Dr. Bhuvan Mathi, Dr. Vishwajit Mojumdar, Dr. Spandan Bhaduri, and Dr. Vishwaranjan Mishra to join the session as the chairperson. And the session 6 is all about test presentations, biggest mistake I have done. And our speaker for this session, the first speaker for this session would be Dr. Vedika Chatterjee, and she will talk about the biggest mistake I have made. Dr. Chatterjee and to the chairperson.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the first speaker. Let me present a case where I have made the biggest mistake of my life. My patient was 55 years old, obese male, smoker, non-diabetic, with history of long-standing hypertension, presented to us with 3 days history of atypical chest pain and shortness of breath. His ECG showed ST depression and symmetrical deep T wave inversion in V3 to V6 and lead 1 AVL, suggestive of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. While doing echocardiogram, in the parasternal long axis view, I got asymmetrical septal hypertrophy. The septum measured 1.91, posterior wall 1.25 centimeter. LV systolic function was good with no regional wall motion abnormality. With the color flow in the parasternal long axis view, I found that there is no turbulence in the LV outflow tract, and M mode at the tip of the mitral valve leaflets did not show evidence of systolic anterior motion, as you can see here. Now, in the apical four-chamber view, I saw the hypertrophy of the septum along with the involvement of the apex. Also, it was obvious in the parasternal short axis at the level of the apex. This is a two-chamber and three-chamber view. In all the views, I got no evidence of regional wall motion abnormality. With color flow in the apical five-chamber view, I found no turbulence across the LV outflow tract. However, there was a turbulence at the LV mid cavity, and with continuous wave Doppler, I got a gradient of 72 millimeter of mercury. So I gave a diagnosis of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with mid cavity obstruction. Since the patient presented with chest pain, though it was atypical, but he had lots of risk factors, like he was obese, he was a smoker, a history of long-standing hypertension. So a coronary angiogram was done. Now in the coronary angiogram, both the left system and the right system were normal. As you can see, this is the right coronary artery, the left also was normal. However, the LV angiogram revealed a large aneurysm at the LV apex. Now, classically, this type of aneurysm is a complication of myocardial infarction. But this patient did not have myocardial infarction. His coronaries were normal. And on top of everything, I didn't get any evidence of aneurysm in the echocardiography. So I thought, let me look at the images which I preserved for this patient in the machine. So I looked at the images. Here are the views which I got in this patient, none of the views revealed the presence of aneurysm. Rather, I got hypertrophy at the LV apex. It didn't reveal any evidence of aneurysm. Then I looked at the color flow. The color flow here, I got the turbulence at the mid cavity, and CW Doppler gave me a gradient of 72 millimeter of mercury. Now, as I looked at the CW signal minutely, I found that though this signal was in systole, but there was another signal in the early diastole. As you can see, the systole ends here, and it was in the early diastole. The image is more clear in this view. If you see, this was the first wave where we got the gradient, and this is the second wave. It was in the diastole rather than systole. It was in early diastole. And if you look at the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with obstruction, whether it's a mid cavity obstruction or LVOT obstruction, we get the signal where the signal of the gradient is exclusively in the systole. This is the mid cavity gradient. It finishes much before the diastole starts. Here also in the LV outflow tract obstruction, it is ending in the systole itself. Whereas in my case, if you look, in my case, the first signal was in systole, the second signal was in early diastole. So immediately I understood that this is an abnormal signal, CW signal, and this patient must be having aneurysm, which I have missed, because in this type of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with mid cavity obstruction, presence of this second signal in the CW Doppler is a clue for the concealed apical aneurysm. I not only missed the aneurysm in the 2D picture, I must have missed this clue. This was first described by Nakamura and his colleagues. This is the signal, which is a clue for the concealed aneurysm. So I called the patient, and initially I didn't get the aneurysm in the fourth chamber, though I thought this is non-foreshortened. But as I tilted the probe further to look at the extreme end of the apex, I got an aneurysm in the fourth chamber as well as in the two chamber. The presence of hypertrophy in the apex, I think, misguided me, and I didn't tilt my probe, so I had missed it. So this is a variety of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with mid-cavity obstruction and apical aneurysm, which is a very unusual phenotype of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy occurring only in 1 to 2% of the cases. Aneurysm, this apical aneurysm is under-recognized. It needs a high index of suspicion, and abnormal CW signal is a clue to the concealed aneurysm. If we look at the mechanism of formation of this apical aneurysm, it's very fascinating. The hypertrophy of the mid-LV, which is exaggerated by long-standing hypertension, often creates two cavities, one proximal with low pressure and one distal with a high pressure. And the persistent high diastolic pressure in the distal cavity leads to the reduced subendocardial perfusion, which leads to chronic ischemia and then necrosis and eventually the aneurysm formation. And it is this relatively higher diastolic pressure in the distal cavity which leads to this paradoxical flow from the distal cavity to the proximal cavity by moving the blood in the early diastole, and that gives this signal. So this aneurysm is often missed due to foreshortening while doing echocardiography. Now, myocardial contrast opacifies the LV, and it may detect the aneurysm. And it is the cardiac MRI, as you can see here. This is LV with the mid cavity obstruction and a large aneurysm. And MRI has got a very high sensitivity to detect these aneurysms. The detection of this aneurysm is very, very essential because this is a very, very high risk subgroup of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with the possibility of thrombus formation in the aneurysm, and eventually a thromboembolic phenomenon is a complication. Also, these patients may develop malignant ventricular tachycardia, leading to sudden cardiac death because of occurrence of re-entry mechanism at the junction of healthy myocardium and necrosed myocardium. So all these conditions can be prevented with effective treatment by ICD or radiofrequency ablation and anticoagulation. And a study was done and which was published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology in 2017, where they did a comparative study of clinical outcome in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients with or without with and without apical aneurysm. The blue bar indicates with aneurysm, red indicates without aneurysm, and what they found that hypertrophy cardiomyopathy related adverse events, including the mortality, arrhythmic events, heart failure, and even thromboembolic events, are much higher in the group with aneurysm than without aneurysm. So my mistakes, I have to agree, my mistakes. First mistake was missing the LV apical aneurysm in 2D echocardiography. I learned a lesson that I should have a very high index of suspicion of LV apical aneurysm in all the cases of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with mid-cavity obstruction. My second mistake is the missing the clue in abnormal CW signal. Again, I learned a lesson that I must be very careful while observing the CW signal of the mid cavity in this subgroup of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patient of mid cavity obstruction. Fortunately, for me, and more importantly for the patient, the LV angiogram was done and it detected the aneurysm, for which I also got a chance to rectify my mistake. And if this aneurysm was missed, the patient would have developed life-threatening complications in near future, which we could prevent by providing the effective medical treatment. Thank you.
Chairpersons.
To Dr. Chatterjee for presenting this excellent case. We do know that masters at times falter. That is true for even Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli. So that is true, and we learned a good lesson also. Now, I want to ask from you, if I face a case like this, mid-cavity obstruction, HOCM, then what should be the ideal approach of probing to pick up this aneurysm?
Yeah, we have to see, though I was thinking...
You got it on the second chance, isn't it, ultimately?
Yes, I tilted the probe, I tilted the probe more anteriorly, more anteriorly while going to the apical four-chamber view. And I tilted it further and further to see the, go beyond the apex, which was, I was thinking apex, it was actually the hypertrophy, not the aneurysm.
Yeah.
It was further from the hypertrophy. So we'll have to...
We have to go beyond in the sacs also, beyond that so-called tip of apex.
Yes. All these off-axis views, you need to do. Yeah.
Because these subgroups are more prone to develop arrhythmic complications also.
Yes. PT.
And thromboembolic complications more.
Yes.
Achha, before going to the other case, Dr. Devika, Dr. Shanmugasundaram has commented one thing about your case. That PWD is ideal to demonstrate the presence and location of the paradoxical flow rather than continuous wave Doppler.
Okay, yeah, that is true.
That is true, absolutely true.
Since I wanted to show both the signals with a gradient and the early diastolic signal without a gradient, and that is the reason, sir. Yes, I know it's a PW signal.
It would have been better to demonstrate at least. Better to demonstrate.
Devika,
Anyway, you picked up in the CW Doppler. That's fine, but PW Doppler would be more easier to find.
Dr. Hazra here.
Yes,
Very
yes,
nice
of course.
case. Once you put your finger and the probe on the patient's chest, if you have such a large aneurysm, definitely you will get a signal from your palpation of the patient. This large aneurysm does give a kind of sensation when once you put a probe in the apex. What is your comment regarding that?
Yeah, you have to palpate before every case. That is another mistake. Mistake number 3. We should go for palpation.
I just add one more thing. Dr. Devika is Ashish here. Just one thing.
Your sound is not very clear, Ashish.
Yes.
Okay. Is it not very clear? Should I take my Bluetooth off?
Your sound is not coming.
Let me take the Bluetooth out. And
Okay. Okay, before
Because Bhattacharya, he is naked.
Dr. Vikas, could you put your SAD on?
Dr. Devika, I'm okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I had one question. Like whenever we do an echo, we always check the ECG. And did you find any changes in the ECG of patient who has an apical cardiomyopathy with this kind of presentation, with an aneurysm? Any changes in the ECG? I believe there is no changes because I was going through one of the article which got published last year, and I did not find any change. So I believe only the person who is doing the echo with high suspicion only can actually catch it. So we clinically also, as Dr. Hazra was talking about, examining the patient and checking for the apical pulsation is going to be difficult while you're actually doing the test. And reading an ECG also is not going to help you into thinking about the aneurysm. So people are going to miss a lot.
High index of suspicion. So whenever
It's all index.
Yes, high index of suspicion.
As there is no time, so I think should go to the second. We have already overstood the 8 minutes.
The chairpersons that we are actually planning to discuss all the cases at the end of the session. If you can kindly hold on to your questions and discuss all the cases and with all the questions when we arrive at the end of this session specifically. And with that, we will move on to the next speaker. And may I please request Dr. Misbahul Firdaus to present his case, and his case is his choice.
One comment about Dr. Misbahul Firdaus. For the last 1 week, he was very enthusiastic to present this very interesting case on this forum. But for 1 week, I was not able to contact him. The reason I do not know. So for that, Chandrima, you can.
Okay, so we will move on. Yeah, we will move on to the third speaker, and may I please request Dr. Rishikesh Shah to present his case, and he will talk about eye sees what the mind knows.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, just a minute. I
haven't shared your screen.
Yeah. That's what I was just trying to share my screen. Oh, I'm not able to share it. Just a minute. I don't know.
Just open the PPT first.
Okay.
Just open the PPT first.
Okay, no, that stops. But I'm still not able to share it. I'm just
trying. If Dr. Anil Singh is prepared, then we can go to the center. Then you can wait for the next.
Yeah. Yes.
By the time.
Yeah.
Chandrima.
Hello.
Yes.
Dr. Anil Singh is prepared.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. So you can go to the. Then
yeah, we will move on to the next speaker then, and he will talk about drowning in the effusion. Over to Dr. Singh.
Yeah. Is my screen visible, sir?
Yeah. And audible.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the organizer for calling me, and it's again a privilege for me to speak in the forum where my Guruji is also in the panel. So the topic is drowning in the effusion. The story goes back 7 years ago. 7 o'clock in the evening in Chennai, I was returning from the hospital, driving, and one call came from the department that one sick baby has come in the emergency room, and I took a U-turn. A 9-year-old boy weighing 24 kilogram, asymptomatic child from the suburb, history of fall from bicycle and chest trauma, presented with progressive chest pain and distress. On quick evaluation outside, the patient was seen in basically cardiology department of medical college with history of chest trauma, and they found severe pericardial effusion with perforation of the lateral right ventricular wall near apex, and they sent to us as a tertiary pediatric cardiac center for further management. The child was apparently absolutely normal pre the cycle fall, no major illness or no hospital admission. On evaluation, he was anxious, irritable, afebrile, tachypneic, tachycardiac. The peripheral pulses were felt. He was saturating well. The blood pressure was 90 millimeter of mercury. His heart sounds as expected were muffled with a normal split of second heart sound. There was no second additional sound. The liver was enlarged and the chest was clear. This was the X-ray he brought along with. Cardiothoracic ratio increased with normal pulmonary blood flow. ECG was showing sinus tachycardia evidence with right axis deviation of the QRS complexes. And quick echocardiogram evaluation showed severe circumferential pericardial effusion, 20 millimeter approx all across. You can appreciate the collapse of the RA free wall as well as right ventricular free wall. There was more than 50% inflow Doppler variations seen in the respiratory pulse wave Doppler interrogation of tricuspid valve. So this, we were dealing with a acute pericardial tamponade resulting from possible cardiac chest trauma. There was no other congenital disease found. The valves were normal. There was no evidence of shunt lesion or any evidence of any aortic dissection. We have not found any evidence of any rent across the right ventricular wall, but interestingly, we could appreciate some flow to and fro going on in the pericardial space in the parasternal as well as subcostal short axis marked by the arrow. So we were wondering whether somewhere some leak and some blood is possibly moving around. We additionally found some dense echogenic mass around the RV considered as possible trauma-induced clot. No evidence of dissection as we thought. We communicated with our team. The surgeons were consulted and called. He was in OT and came and saw. A CT scan was planned in the night, but it was late night. Child was very sick, so it was decided to act fast. The child was moved from the echo room to the cardiac operation theater for emergency sternotomy pending basic laboratory evaluation like pre-surgical test and serology, etc., in view of trauma and tamponade. And we had to sign that, okay, clear for everything, urgent surgery. And I got a call from OT, surprise on table. Actually, that was a trauma to the doctor, not the patient. And that's what the surgeons found. A large mediastinal tumor after opening, and he drained all the pericardial fluid. The biopsy samples were taken and some debulking of the tumor was done. The patient has a stormy postoperative period, significant bleeding. It required re-exploration in the morning again. Child required factor 8 for controlling the 7 for the bleeding, and 3 days of intense ICU care. The laboratory evaluation which came while OT was going on, the child had microcytic hypochromic anemia and leukocytosis with count 1,15,000, predominantly lymphoid lineage blast cells, metamyelocyte 2%, and the pericardial fluid was purulent, though no organism found. The histopathology showed large mediastinal tumor, malignant small round cell tumor with features suggestive of diffuse high-grade non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, possibly lymphoblastic variety. So this was the X-ray, and you can appreciate there is not much of change between pre and post X-ray. This is the post-operative echo showing only thin rim of pericardial effusion. So patient was referred to pediatric oncology unit of another hospital, had high financial burden for complicated thoracic intervention, which was thankfully waived off by the social support unit of the hospital. He underwent oncotherapy for the lymphoid malignancy, had complete remission and doing well in the follow-up. So to conclude, in an emergent condition with misleading history, sometimes it's very difficult to reach correct etiological diagnosis. Waiting for CBC and other tests to come and getting CT thorax done could have changed the plan, but situation was not like that. Though hemodynamic diagnosis was correct, but inappropriate etiological suspicion led to unnecessarily intervention with stormy course. Alert out of box thinking and examination could have helped the clinician for the day. So wish to thank sincerely Dr. Shivakumar, Dr. Roy Varghese, Dr. Bharat, and our Chennai support staff, Ms. Rupa and Rashmi, for helping me out old story of this magnificent miss. And I hope it will be good to be more vigilant in the future. Thank you.
Dr. Ezike Sai is ready. Dr. Sai, you are ready.
Anil, what about giving saline, venous saline, and see the contrast emerging from RV to pericardium? You know, that is kind of a red herring. Very nice case.
Sir, the patient was very sick. You can imagine from OT, the echo room to OT personally shifted. He was very sick. On hindsight, the X-ray itself was showing mediastinal widening, and that was possibly the lymphoma mass. In the X-ray echo also, what we thought as clot is not clot. It was basically lymphoma visible. The abrupt, unexpected symptom in an index case result, though lymphoma is known to present with effusion, but like that unsuspected is rare, and that was the reason we missed the etiology.
Fantastic case, Dr. Singhi, Dr. Pandey here. So how do you explain why the patient got so sick after falling from bicycle? What happened?
One very interesting phenomenon about the pediatric malignancies, especially lymphoid series, they do not tolerate any acute trauma. Even say endotracheal intubation effort also is known to induce acute catastrophe. So possibly the cycle fall was the initiator of the noxious stimuli, which resulted in the whole episode. We have seen in pediatric practice that any even needle prick we were not doing in a patient who is suspected to have a mediastinal mass. And there is an indication for giving pulse chemotherapy without etiological diagnosis in a suspected case, because these patients are very bizarre and very atypically presenting in this sickness. This may be one of the reasons I am thinking on an hindsight.
What do you suggest? Was the effusion present before? So, Dr. Hazra, please.
Yeah, pericardium is the only space in human heart we do not get thrombus because of constant rubbing and movement. That's the point of differentiation between your hemorrhagic and...
no, it was mediastinal clot, we thought. We thought there is some clot material in that region. That was a suspicion. We missed it, sir. We missed.
Dr. Kumar, Dr. Bhaduri here, whether the blood report came in post-operative period. That
no, while OT is going on, sir, everything was going on parallelly. When the surgeons were opening the chest, by the time surgeons committed.
Came. Okay. And the effusion is purulent.
Fix that RVTR by device. Let's discuss that. Can you avoid it completely a surgery?
No, but there was no rent found. The flow, what I saw was an artifact possibly. Okay. On an hindsight, lot of loopholes in the whole case.
maybe I can add a little bit from my experience. I think it's a wonderful case because I think we should all be aware that pericardial effusions can have many causes, and that if you, of course, have a situation where someone has an accident, obviously the first thing you will think of is that it's related to the trauma. So I can completely relate on your reasoning. One thing that maybe could point another direction is the size of the pericardial effusion, because if you do have an acute trauma, usually these effusions are quite small and they can still cause tamponade. And the second thing is that if it's really blood, if it's pure bleeding, you would see clot, you would see some form of coagulation going on within the pericardial sac. And at least in my opinion, if you see anything that looks like blood coming out of the heart into the pericardial sac, the patient is dead within a few seconds. I think the only way that someone can survive with some form of a injury to the heart is if it is really, really small and partially concealed through some hematoma or some obstruction, like in pseudoaneurysms. Unfortunately, most patients die quite quickly. So, I would be probably in such a situation looking for clot or some cloudy haziness in the pericardial sac. And I guess what you saw, and which I would probably also, difficult to judge what it is, but the flow you see is probably the movement of the heart within the pericardial sac that does bring the blood flow into the motion.
Okay, sir. No more question in this because we are running short of time. Then we'll go to the next case. If Dr. Hesychius is ready, otherwise go to Dr. Thomas Binder.
Yes, I am ready. I am ready.
Okay, go to the Dr. Hesychius.
Okay. Okay. Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, audible and visible, both. You go on.
Thank you. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I am presenting a short case here today. The eye sees what the mind knows. 62 years male, known case of hypertension and diabetes since 15 years, came with sudden onset of breathlessness and sweating. On examination, his heart rate was 120 per minute, regular. Blood pressure was around 110 by 70 millimeters of mercury. His respiratory rate was 32 per minute and oxygen saturation was 90% on room air. Cardiovascular S1 was soft. There was pansystolic murmur at the apex and there was S3 gallop. Respiratory system showed bilateral basal creps. He was conscious oriented but bit anxious. His 2D echo revealed this. His LV function looks normal. This is parasternal long axis view. And you could see that on AML, there is some mass-like structure seen on the AML. Color flow interrogation of this showed that there is an MR which is posterior directed. The MR is adducting the PML. The cause of MR still was quite unknown. These are the short axis images at the papillary muscle, at the apex, and at the level of the mitral wall, and it shows a hyperdynamic LV. So LV function was far more better, above normal, you can see. This was the mitral inflow velocities with E and A ratio more than 5. The aortic velocities were normal. And the pulmonary artery systolic pressure calculated by TRJet came to around 75 millimeters of mercury. So this patient had all the features of raised LVDP with pH and hyperdynamic heart. So an LV failure with hyperdynamic heart and some amount of an MR, we probably would think that we were dealing with some kind of acute MR. The cause of MR was not known, and we just couldn't find out what was the reason for this MR. This is in a 4-chamber view. Again, you can see the heart is hyperdynamic. The LV is pretty normal. The AML and PML are co-opting well. There is no non-cooptation there, but there's something there on the AML which is not very clear. This is a 2-chamber view, again showing a very good hyperdynamic heart. And you can see here also the MR is posterior directed. It is wall hugging and it is going all the way to the LA. So this is significant MR definitely. Apart from this, in the 4-chamber view, we found that there is some mass which was trying to indent the RA. We don't know what it was, but there was something which was fishy. Apart from this, patient had bilateral pleural effusion. So no doubt this patient was in frank left ventricular, frank heart failure with an hyperdynamic heart and an acute MR. Probably we were dealing with acute. We knew that we were probably underestimating MR on transthoracic echo. So we went ahead and did an T. So let's see on T. So this is a 5-chamber view at 0 degrees. We've just pulled out a probe a little bit and you can see there is some cystic shadow or cystic mass on the AML. On further interrogation, this is a short axis view at the level of the aortic wall, and you can see just besides the aortic wall, there is one more cystic shadow, which is again pulsatile, and it is with each systole and diastole, it is pulsating as the aortic wall is opening and closing. Not only that, whatever mass we could see on a transthoracic echo, we could see that there was one more mass which was actually indenting the RA wall. The mass was definitely outside because we could clearly see the mass was also pulsatile and it has its own pulsation, which was different from the cardiac contraction, which could be clearly seen. Still, we couldn't get the reason of MR. And you can see this in Foch-Iberville, we can find that there is an MR which is posterior directed. And then we went to this view, which actually helped us to clinch the diagnosis. So this was nothing but an aortomitral curtain, aortomitral intervalvular fibrosa aneurysm. So one part of the aneurysm had burrowed into the aortic root and another part was there into the LA. If you could clearly see, this aneurysm towards the LA had also ruptured. So definitely there was a communication between this aortomitral curtain aneurysm and LA. Color flow interrogation showed us, okay, yes, there was definitely a severe florid MR. Now, technically, we cannot call this as mitral regurgitation, but definitely we can call it also because the blood flow was from LV to LA, although it was not through mitral wall, it was through aortomitral curtain aneurysm or aortomitral intervalvular fibrosa aneurysm, which was ruptured into the LA. There is no doubt this was a florid MR. So we showed these pictures to the surgeon, and surgeon also felt, yes, this was an aortomitral curtain aneurysm which needs to be repaired on an urgent basis. One question remained unanswered was, what was that mass which was trying to indent on the RA? Surgeon felt, so since patient had acute mitral regurgitation through ruptured aneurysm of aortomitral intervalvular fibrosa, we decided to surgically repair the aneurysm. It was decided to send the patient for CT scan of the heart to ascertain the cause of the mass compressing over the RA. As the patient was hemodynamically unstable and his creatinine was also raised, CT scan was not done. The radiologist told us, we cannot give in contrast with a high creatinine and there's no point in going ahead with plain mass. So surgeon again resaw the images. He said that probably it looks like some kind of pericardial cyst. He will take care of. He doesn't require much of this. And he said, I'll go ahead. His plan was very clear to approach the, open the LA and just to put a pericardial patch or some kind of patch and repair the aneurysm. Since the mitral wall was normal and aortic wall was normal, nothing needs to be done. So his surgery was bit, simple and straightforward. His patient underwent a coronary angiography prior to surgery, which was normal. See this, the LAD and circumflex and the RCA, both were normal. So on the operating table, cardiac surgeon found out that the mass compressing RRA was just a loculated pericardial effusion. So he just put a nick and drained it. Now, while approaching to open the LA, he tried to remove the pericardium, and to his horror, whole of the pericardium was adhered to the underlying heart because the patient actually had constrictive pericarditis, which we had totally missed. The cardiac surgeon abandoned the trans-LA approach and went through the trans-aortic approach. So he couldn't go through posteriorly. So he opened the aorta, he went. So what he did, he sacrificed the aortic wall, he managed to repair the aneurysm and also performed AVR. He, however, could not remove the pericardial constriction entirely. Histopathology of the aneurysm tissue and pericardial tissue revealed that this was all granulomatous tuberculosis. So what was the thing? Why couldn't we diagnose that this patient had a constriction when this patient presented to us? So what were the lessons learned? The signs of constrictive pericarditis got masked due to raised LV filling pressures due to acute mitral regurgitation. We should have thought of tuberculosis as a cause of aortointervalvular fibrosa aneurysm and should have opted for multimodality imaging like CT scan of the heart and cardiac MRI before subjecting the patient for aneurysm repair surgery. When dealing with acute cardiac lesion, especially acute MR and acute AR, try and make every attempt and use all the modality at your disposal to uncover the underlying pathology. Most of the time, these acute things hide something or the else below it. So you just uncover those things and then you'll try and get the whole picture. So do not get mesmerized by simply one cardiac pathology. Try to unravel the whole picture. Thank you. Yes.
Superb case. Like when you see two valves regurgitating with effusion, there are certain conditions comes to physician's mind.
Yes.
Definitely in India, one of the things which we got wiser in hindsight, tuberculosis.
Yes.
Second is SLE, the systemic lupus erythematosus, where it can affect the kidney, pericardium, and the valves. And third will be some kind of malignancy, fibroelastoma of the mitral valve, which can invade the aortic thing. It was looking like a fibroelastoma to me. I do not know. You may make me wiser how fibroelastoma looks like and how it is different from the routine aneurysms.
Right.
Dr. Saad, Dr. Ashish here.
Yes.
Really interesting. I have not seen this kind of case in my career. So I probably won't be able to comment it, but then I feel clinically, did you plan to be, I know there was a lot of systolic murmur, but pericardial rub, I doubt you could have heard pericardial rub or even the ECG changes or anything as such which could help you.
Yeah, it was whole of it. It was constrictive pericarditis. Now let us revisit a few things. So what are the common echo findings which we get in constrictive pericarditis? There are 4 or 5 findings which are most common. One is mitral inflow velocities variation is more than 30%. There is something known as respiratory bounce or respiratory movement of the septum, in which inspiratory the septum moves towards the LV, in expiration most. That is due to interventricular interdependence. Then we have what is known as paradoxical
Right.
E by E prime, whereby E by E prime is normal while still LVDP. Then we have mitral annulus reversus, where the medial E prime is higher than the lateral E prime, which is normally the opposite. And most important is the IVC. With post-expiratory show a reversal flow. Now just consider this case with acute MR. In a setting of acute MR with raised LVDP, you will find that none of these echocardio findings will be obvious. So all will be getting marks because you see the right-sided pressures were so high. 75 was the pulmonary systolic pressure, the high LA filling pressure, high LVDP. None of the signs would be matching. You won't be able to diagnose it even if you want. Only thing here is what I mean to say is we should have suspicion. Probably this was tuberculosis, some causative which would have led to some pathology in the heart. So we should try and investigate it with modality. Probably echo may not always gives the answer, but unless you have that at the back of your mind, it becomes difficult to diagnose. That's
Dr. Saad, the reason why we are discussing today is this because we never thought about it. That's why this session is here.
Right.
And if we could have thought, we probably would not have been discussing about this here.
That's very true.
So, yeah. So I understand it was a difficult case and a good case. I really appreciate. I have learned a lot from this. And thank you so much for your presentation.
Absolutely.
I think we can go ahead.
Now go on to the next case, please. Look, because of running sort of time, the next case. Chandrima, the next case.
We will move on to Dr. Thomas Binder now. He will talk about his case, probability pitfall.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation to be here. It's a really true pleasure to join in on this absolutely fantastic session, because I think this is such an important one too, because I think we best learn from mistakes. So this is certainly something that I'm looking forward to. And I'm just trying to find the right presentation here. Okay, good. So my case, can you see my slides?
Yes, please. And now you are audible.
Okay, so my case I will call probability pitfall. And it's a case that I experienced many years ago, as you will see. And in a way, I can maybe phrase this case as a quote that many of you might have heard. If you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. So this is what we usually try to do in clinical practice. We look for the obvious first, and we kind of sometimes forget that there might be surprises along the way while we go. And when I was when I had this case, this was, I think, almost 25 years ago. This was a picture of me, my father, and some of my coworkers at the time. Of course, I was very, very young. I worked at the Medical University of Vienna. We just moved into this new building at the time. It was, for us, a big relief because the old building was definitely not as modern and well-equipped as what we had then. And we had all the resources we could only imagine. At that time, a lot of the money that the healthcare system had in Austria was put into this hospital, and we were just of course, sophisticated at that time and had so many different resources. And I worked at that time in the emergency department. Now, the emergency department was something new. At that time, we didn't have that in any other hospitals, to really have an emergency department where a helicopter would land and bring some patients in. This was quite new at the time in Austria. And this is the helicopter pad of our hospital. And at the time, a patient was brought in through to the hospital with a suspected aortic dissection. And this is the intensive care unit at the emergency department. This is actually exactly that bed where the patient was placed. So you see, at that time, we already had ultrasound and we had all the resources necessary to intubate the patient. And it was in my shift. And the patient came with aortic dissection. And what we were looking for, obviously, was whether or not dissection was true or not. And there was a report of the situation was that they found a dissection in the abdomen and then also with echocardiography in the thoracic aorta. And the patient was, I would say, relatively stable, but he was sweating. He was very nervous. He had, a pain, but he was, I would say, not in shock. Nevertheless, what we saw was this here in the abdominal aorta. So I guess for me, it was quite clear when I saw this must be an aortic dissection. At that time, I was not very, very familiar with abdominal ultrasound. Someone else did the exam. Let me state, though, that the case that I'm showing you here now is, of course, not the original case. The loops were, I think, 35 years old. I don't even have them anymore. So what I'm doing here is I'm reconstructing the case with very similar images, but I think you will get the point. So what we saw was the abdominal ultrasound with a dissection membrane that you see right here. And then I performed a transthoracic echo, and this is a parasternal long axis view. I'm moving up the transducer one intercostal space so that I see more of the ascending aorta, and then I see this structure right here. And then, for me, this was obviously, again, to confirm that aortic dissection was there. I also looked from a subcostal approach, not good image quality. Something was moving here, and again, the dissection for me was quite clear. But at that time, it was always the question, what is the next step? Now it's quite clear you would definitely go to CT and you would go to radiology. Certainly TE at that time, though, was a very big option and certainly something that would be a methodology to clarify and to certify that dissection was truly present. And so we went on and performed a TE study, and clearly there was a dissection in the descending part of the aorta. This is the aorta, as you can see, right below the subclavian artery in the cranial portion of the descending aorta with a true and a false membrane. I was even able to detect some flow across the membrane, and for me, it was clear that there was a dissection there. So here again is the flow. This is the true lumen. This is the false lumen, and this is the dissection. And then I performed also a view of the ascending aorta, and what I also suspected to see there was a dissection. At that time, the patient was also had a pulmonary catheter in place to do some hemodynamic monitoring. That's what we did at that time. And nevertheless, I had the impression that there was a dissection there as well. And if you look at the indications for surgery, if you have someone who has a type B dissection where only the descending part of the aorta is involved, you would maybe stabilize the patient or maybe now perform a stent. But it is different if you also have dissection of the ascending part, so a type A classification. And for me, the diagnosis was this here. A dissection in the ascending part, we saw something here from suprasternal and also in the T study. So it was also the descending part. I also saw it going down all the way to the abdomen. So this is the finding. And the next step obviously was to call the surgeon, right? So these again are the indications for operation, surgery, type A dissection involving the ascending aorta. In TEVAR, a stent would be if you have complicated type B. This is what we do nowadays. So the patient went on to the operating room. I went back to my room, and all of a sudden I got this call from the surgeon, actually from the anesthesiologist, and he said, "Wait, what have you sent us here? This is no dissection. I don't see anything in the ascending aorta. I'm doing a T study here. I'm looking from all angles. There's just nothing to see there." And I was like kind of shocked and amazed how this could be possible. So I raced down to the operating room and I performed the T study together with the colleague. And yeah, there was nothing there. I was absolutely sure that initially there was a dissection, but now it was gone. What was going on? It was quite unclear. So what I did, and what obviously we needed to do, was we just took the patient down from the operating room. Luckily, the surgeons did not cut into the patient yet, and we brought him to CT, and the CT confirmed that there was no dissection there. So for me, this was a strange situation, and I was wondering, why could that happen? I mean, I saw this transthoracic echo with the dissection, and how can I just miss this? And I was like also shocked, because at that time, you just imagine, I was young, my reputation was at stake. The patient was, of course, in a situation where he might have had an operation, even though he didn't need one. And then I went on to research and of course go back to the radiologist and to make sure that there was truly no dissection, which there was not. Well, the problem is, and this is the study, not of this patient, but a study I've seen so many times in a similar form in other patients, where you see something here in the ascending aorta, which appears as if it is a dissection membrane, but in reality it is not. This is a simple reverberation. And the way you can tell it's a reverberation is that you see that the distance from the tip of the transducer to this anterior part of the ascending aorta is pretty much the same as the distance from here to here. So it's an equivocal distance. So there's kind of reverberation that repeats the echo of the anterior wall of the aorta further down here. And if you really want to differentiate that from a true dissection, you could even use an M mode and kind of see if this membrane here moves in parallel with the ascending aorta. Now, this is another patient, and again, you might think this must be a dissection, but again, in reality, it is not. Here you have the additional factor that there's a little bit of fluid right here, which enhances the reflectivity of the anterior wall of the aorta, and thereby even makes more reverberation. So this is another example where you might be wrong. Here's the third case that I've documented, again with a very similar finding. This is not a dissection. This is definitely a reverberation. While this here is a true dissection. You can see that it moves different than the anterior wall. It has more a tangential motion here. We see that this patient also has a little bit of a dilatation of the aorta. What you can obviously do is you can also use color. And if we use color in these patients where we think there's a dissection, we see there's just homogeneous color all over the place. And there's no slow area of slow flow and higher flow as you would see it in a true case of dissection. So the tip here to prevent this from happening is to use color, to use M mode, to use multiple views, and to angulate the transducer so that you avoid this shortcoming. And then to use obviously other imaging modalities in CT. And this is something I do very frequently now, even though if I'm very, very sure, we still do a CT, because the information we get from the CT and from the echo is usually complementary. Now, you will probably ask yourself, well, what did I see in the transesophageal echo? The problem was, and I can't repeat to showing you this because I don't have the loops anymore, the patient had a reflection, a reverberation, which projected into the ascending aorta. And thereby, I also thought that this must be a dissection membrane. So in reality, I was kind of fooled. Yes, the patient had a dissection, the descending aorta. Yes, he had one in the abdomen. And I thought, well, if it's there, it's going to be up there too. So I thought that, if you see, if you hear hoofbeats, it must be a cow. And in this case, it was a zebra. It was not really a dissection at all. So for me, this was one of the most important learnings I had, and I was, of course, able to avoid this pitfall in many, many other situations. And I teach my younger fellows that this is something that they should be aware of. So I hope this can contribute to your session and maybe also help many others to avoid this situation and to avoid this pitfall. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Excellent, Thomas.
Shall we move on to the last speaker?
Mhm.
We will move on to the last speaker for this session, and may I please request Dr. K. Shivakumar to present his case. He will talk about birth safety from a catastrophic aspiration.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yeah, and this.
Yeah, thank you. So the case that I am presenting is a 14-year-old girl who presented with acute left hemiplegia. We can appreciate an infarct in the capsular region of the MRI. Echo showed a normal heart. The transthoracic bubble study was negative. Clinical examination of the heart was normal. The carotids were normally palpable. ECG and Holter did not show any atrial arrhythmia. And she was started on aspirin and clopidogrel. 2 months later, she presents with a second tertiary infarct. Previously, it was on the right side. Now this is on the left side. She clinically presents with aphasia and right facial palsy. MRI now shows an infarct in the left frontotemporal cortex. More extensive MRI was done, MR angiography, all the 4 vessels were normal. More extensive vascular work was done for vasculitis, all were negative. A repeat bubble study was done, which was also negative. So this time she was started on warfarin in addition to aspirin. Just 1 month later, another episode of right hemiparesis and a brief unconsciousness. So in view of repeated episodes, a patent foramen ovale with recurrent embolism was again suspected. The transesophageal echocardiogram did not show any foramen ovale, and an aggressive contrast study failed to reveal anything going on to the left atrium. MRI showed fresh and old infarcts. Repeat bubble study, there was no right left shunt. And since there were repeated large infarcts, warfarin was taken out, and again she was put back on aspirin and clopidogrel because of risk of bleed into all those infarcts. So there are 3 admissions in a neurology institute, no definite etiology. So she was suspected to have a mitochondrial disease, started on different mitochondrial centric medications, and she was discharged on aspirin and clopidogrel with a very guarded prognosis for recurrences. When she presented to us, no structural heart disease was identified. She had a normal clinical examination of the cardiovascular system, normal pulses, carotids were normal, blood pressure was normal in all the 4 limbs, heart sounds was normal. Echocardiogram did not pick up anything abnormal. The normal left ventricular function, mitral valve, aortic valve was normal, ascending aorta was normal. Apical 4-chamber showed a normal left ventricular systolic contractility. But in the previous 1 or 2 echocardiogram also, there was a subtle suspicion about some pericardial effusion. If you carefully see here, there is some amount of space around. And here there is a space around the left ventricle. In fact, in view of this mild pericardial effusion, vasculitis was suspected and inflammatory markers were done. ANCA antibodies were done. They were all negative. So there is minimal pericardial effusion. Suspicion was vasculitis, but all the inflammatory markers were negative. So we thought whether yes, pericardial fluid will help to pick up whether there is any evidence of vasculitis. We just heard about 3 speakers before was mentioning tuberculosis can be a very great masquerader. And so she was admitted in the daycare for a pericardial tap. So before the pericardial tap, another echocardiogram was done to identify where we should tap, whether it is subxiphoid or whether it is in the apical region. So an echocardiogram was repeated. In the subxiphoid area, the fluid was not very clearly seen. So it was seen more somewhere near the apical region. So we were just planning where to poke here. So we were just like positioning our probes. As we moved a little bit towards the left side, we could identify that there is an effusion here with some strands of tissues. So we thought that it is a little on the leftward side, we may get a tap. So we were thinking about poking it on the left side of the apex. So this is again LA and LV with mitral valve. And somewhere along the left side was the effusion. And when we carefully analyzed that area, there were some strands of tissues, some lines that were seen. So we were thinking that probably these were all adhesions. And so we probably are hitting at something like a tuberculous pericardial effusion with multiple strands of tissue. So we were planning to get our needle into this area to find out the nature of the fluid. As we moved further to the left, we could identify a little better that effusion. We can identify again some strand of tissue. And when we put the color, actually there was no color that was entering into that sac. So we thought it is more towards the leftward side. As we were doing another repeat parasternal view, we found something very fishy. The aorta, left atrium, and there was some broad cavity from the leftward wall of the left atrium in the region of left atrial appendage. So here we were able to find out some color bizarrely entering into that sac and then coming back. So we, instead of doing a pericardial tap, we decided to do a transesophageal echocardiogram. And in transesophageal echocardiogram, we could identify there is a to and fro color flow into a huge sac on the left side of the LA in the region of left atrial appendage. This is the aortic root. So the aortic root with a large cavity, and we can identify strands of tissue here. So then we now recognize that these strands of tissue are probably the thrombus within that sac. So then we were curious, why did we miss it on a thoracic echocardiogram? Now we moved the probe to the mid-axillary line, completely out of the apex. And there we could identify a large sac, which was almost the size of the heart. All the four chambers put together, the size of this cavity was so large, with blood entering to and fro into this aneurysm, connected to the left atrial appendage. A CT scan showed that this was a large left atrial appendage aneurysm. The cumulative size of the aneurysm was as large as the LA and LV together, with a very broad mouth of that aneurysm. And this was that huge aneurysm color-coded, the left atrium and left ventricle, and a massive aneurysm on the leftward side. Now we had this stroke on this girl just about 1 week ago. The last stroke was 1 week ago. So to put her on a cardiopulmonary bypass is going to be difficult. So we took her into the cath lab. We put bilateral carotid filters. This is a right filter and a left filter. Though both the carotids are now filters are put in. Now we entered into the transeptal puncture and entered into the left atrium. And from the left atrium, we made an angiography. And we could identify, this is the left atrium, left ventricle, and the aorta, and the mouth of the large aneurysm. And this was a massive aneurysm on the left side. Having identified it, we put in a sheet into that aneurysm. We had already protected the carotids with a filter. So we put a sheet into that aneurysm and delineated that aneurysm. The aneurysm was a massive aneurysm. And we closed it, the mouth of the aneurysm, with an occluder. This was immediately after the aneurysm closure. You can see the large aneurysm, which is completely clotted out by the device. 3 years later, that whole aneurysm has shrunk. The device is fully endothelialized. and there are no recurrences of stroke, aspirin was withdrawn. So whenever there is a recurrent stroke in a young patient with a negative bubble study, we have very minimal therapeutic solutions. Since this patient had a localized pericardial effusion around the left ventricle, we were suspecting some form of a vasculitis, possibly tuberculous, and we planned a fluid tap. A pre-fluid tap echocardiogram demonstrated a giant left atrial appendage aneurysm. A tap would have been catastrophic because if there had been a bleed and we need to open the chest for controlling the bleed, we would have needed bypass, and cardiopulmonary bypass on heparin in a patient with a recent stroke 1 week ago would have been catastrophic. So in all patients with stroke, an extremely aggressive pursuit for causes will lead to either paroxysms of atrial fibrillation or a PFO with a right to left shunt, or some deep vein thrombosis with a paradoxical embolism, or an ascending aortic atheroma, or some irregularities in the aorta or carotids, or very, very rarely a massive left atrial appendage aneurysm like what we saw. So we were saved from tapping this pericardial fluid by some pre-tap echocardiography. Thank you very much.
Shivakumar, why didn't you think of Watchman or amulet-like device? Because you have left with a cul-de-sac. The sac left between the os of the appendage and your device. There is a lot of space left. So that is another precursor for thrombus in the future.
Actually, we have occluded the mouth of the aneurysm. So the moment the mouth is occluded, all the thrombus that are present within the aneurysm is trapped within the aneurysm. And what is left behind is only the left atrial surface of the device. The second one is, this is not like a left atrial appendage device closure wherein the distal part of the appendage is just a conical end. This is another large 11 centimeter aneurysm on the other side. So we need to have a retention skirt on either side in order to anchor it. And the aneurysm was measuring around 20 millimeter, and a device like an ACP, amulet, or Watchman all will not be able to sit in that mouth. The mouth is actually, it's more like a ventricular septal defect between the left and the right ventricle. 11 centimeter cavity on one side and a 5 centimeter left atrial cavity on the other side.